And as for the drug, my friend's guess is that it does indeed cancel out the influence of mascons of earlier vintage. Mascons introduced some time ago, but it doesn't stop them all, particularly not the most recent. In which case this, the professor held up the flask, would be no restorative at all, but a most treacherously devised mascon, a counterfeit countermeasure, a double reagent, or, in other words, a wolf in sheep's clothing. But why? If it's really necessary for someone to know, necessary for the general welfare, for society, for all mankind, but not from the point of view of the special interests of certain politicians, corporations, even departments of the government. If things are worse than we, the soothsayers, suspect, then they don't want us sounding the alarm, and thus this drug is made available. Much like the old trick where one would set up easily discovered hiding places for a thief, in the hopes that he'd be satisfied with his first find and not seek out the real, far more cleverly concealed treasure. Yes, I think I understand. But just what do you want of me? While you're acquainting yourself with these materials, take a sniff from the first phial, here, then a sniff from the second. Frankly, I haven't the courage. Is that all? Hand them over then. I took both glass tubes from the professor, pulled up a chair and began to familiarize myself one by one with the abstracts of the papers submitted to the Futurological Congress. The first proposal envisaged a complete restructuring of attitudes to be brought about by the introduction into the atmosphere of 1,000 tons of reversal, which would effect a full 180-degree change in everyone's feelings. In the first phase, after the dispersion of the drug, comfort, abundance, delicious food, aesthetic objects, elegance, all such things would overnight become despised, while crowding, poverty, ugliness, and deprivation would be valued above all else. In the second phase, the mascons and super neo-mascons would be totally removed or neutralized. Only now would the people confronted with reality for the first time in their lives find happiness, for they would have before them everything their heart desired. One might even activate the exacerbants to worsen living conditions a little. But since reversal makes no exceptions in its inverting effect, erotic pleasures too would be rendered loathsome, and that would threaten mankind with extinction. Therefore, once a year for 24 hours, the drug's influence would be temporarily suspended by an appropriate antidote. On what day we would undoubtedly have a sharp rise in the number of suicides, yet this would be more than compensated for the simultaneously initiated increase in the birth rate. I can't say the plan aroused my enthusiasm. The only commendable point in it was the one which said that the originator of this proposal, as a member of the soothsayer class, should himself take the antidote on a permanent basis, so that neither the ubiquitous misery nor the ugliness, neither the mire nor the tedium of life could afford him any particular delight. The second proposal provided for the dissolving of 10,000 tons of retrotemporox in the waters of the rivers and oceans. This drug reverses the flow of subjective time. Life would thus unfold in the following fashion. People would come into the world as doddering old men and take their leave of it as newborn infants. In this way, the author argued, we would be removing the main drawback of the human condition, which is, for every man, the prospect of inevitable aging and death. With the passage of time, then, each senior citizen grows younger and younger, gaining in strength and vigor. Upon retirement, being under age for work, he enters the blessed realm of childhood. The humanness of the proposal derived from the natural ignorance of the mortality of all living things which is characteristic of the very young. Of course, in actual fact, since this turning back of time was purely subjective, we would not be leading babies to the kindergartens, nurseries, and delivery rooms, but old men. The author wasn't too clear on what ought to be done with them after that, but only observed in a general way that they might be given suitable therapy in the National Euthanasium. Reading this raised the first proposal considerably in my estimation. The third proposal was long-range and far more drastic. It advocated ectogenesis, prostheticism, and universal transception. Of man, only the brain would remain, beautifully encased in duraplast, a globe equipped with sockets, plugs, and clasps, and powered by atomic battery, so the ingestion of nutriments, now physically superfluous, would take place only through illusion, programmed accordingly. The brain case could be connected to any number of appendages, apparatuses, machines, vehicles, etc. This prosthesization process would be spread over 2 decades, with partial replacements mandatory for the first 10 years, leaving all unnecessary organs at home. For example, when going to the theater, one would detach one's fornication and defecation modules and hang them in the closet. Then, in the next 10 years, transepting would do away with crowds and congestion, the consequences of overpopulation. Channels of interbrain communications, whether by cable or radio, would make pointless all gatherings and get-togethers, excursions and journeys to attend conferences, and therefore all personal locomotion to whatever location. For every living being could avail itself of sensors and scanners situated over the whole expanse of human habitation, even to the furthermost planets. Mass production would keep the market supplied with custom-made internal components and accessories, including brain tracks for home railways that would enable the heads themselves to roll from room to room, an innocent diversion. At this point I stopped and remarked that the authors of these papers were surely deranged. Trottelreiner replied coldly that I was a bit hasty in my judgment. We made our bed and now we must lie in it. Anyhow, the criterion of common sense was never applicable to the history of the human race. Averroes, Kant, Socrates, Newton, Voltaire, could any of them have believed it possible that in the 20th century the scourge of cities, the prisoner of lungs, the mass murderer and idol of millions would be a metal receptacle on wheels, and that people would actually prefer being crushed to death inside it during frantic weekend exoduses instead of staying safe and sound at home? I asked him which of the proposals he intended to support. "I haven't yet decided," he said. "The gravest problem, in my opinion, is the increase in underground natalities, unlicensed births. And besides that, I'm afraid there may be some psychem tampering in the course of the deliberations." "How do you mean?" "A proposal could be passed with the help of a gulliblin or two." "You think they would actually try such a thing?" "Why not? What could be easier than pumping gas into our conference hall through the air conditioning?" "But whatever the Congress endorses doesn't have to be accepted by the public. The people won't take everything lying down." "Come now, Tichy. For half a century civilization hasn't been left to its own devices. 100 years ago a certain Dior was dictating fashions in clothing. Today this sort of regulating has embraced all walks of life. If prostheticism is voted in, I assure you, in a couple of years everyone will consider the possession of a soft, hairy, sweating body to be shameful and indecent. A body needs washing, deodorizing, caring for, and even then it breaks down, while in a prostheticized society you can snap on the loveliest creation of modern engineering. What woman doesn't want to have silver iodide instead of eyes, telescopic breasts, angel's wings, iridescent legs, and feet that sing with every step?" "Listen," I said, "let's run away. We can get a supply of oxygen provisions and hole up somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. Remember the sewers of the Hilton? It wasn't all that bad there, was it?" "You're not serious," began the professor as if hesitating. By sheer accident, I happened to raise the vial to my nose. I had completely forgotten that I was still holding it. Tears welled up from the acrid smell. I sneezed and sneezed again, and when I opened my eyes, the room had changed. The professor was still speaking. I could hear his voice, but fascinated by the transformation, no longer listened to the words. The walls were now all covered in grime. The blue sky had taken on a brownish tinge. Some of the window panes were missing, and the rest had a coat of greasy soot, streaked with grey from previous rains. I don't know why, but it was particularly upsetting to see that the professor's handsome briefcase, the one in which he'd brought the conference materials, had turned into a mouldy old satchel. I grew numb. I was afraid to look at him. I peeked under the desk. Instead of his appliqued trousers and professorial spats, there were two casually crossed artificial legs. Between the wire tendons of the feet, bits of gravel were lodged, and mud from the street. The steel pin of the heel gleamed, worn smooth with use. I groaned. "What is it? A headache? Want an aspirin?" came the sympathetic voice. I gritted my teeth and looked up. Not much was left of the face. Stuck to his sunken cheeks were the rotting shreds of bandage that hadn't been changed in ages. And evidently he still wore glasses, though one of the lenses was cracked. In his neck, in the opening of a tracheotomy, a vocoder had been inserted, carelessly enough, and it bobbed up and down as he talked. A jacket hung in mildewed tatters on the rack that was his chest, and beneath the left lapel there was a gaping hole lidded with a cloudy plastic window. Inside, a heart, held together with clamps and staples, beat in blue-black spasms. I didn't see a left hand. The right, clutching a pencil, was fashioned out of brass and green with verdigris. Soon to his collar, a crooked label on which someone had scribbled in red ink, "Barber 119-859-21, Transpol/5 Reject." I stared, eyes popping, while the professor, taking on my horror like a mirror, suddenly froze behind his desk. I've changed, haven't I?" he croaked. The next thing I knew, I was struggling with the doorknob. "Tihe! What are you doing? Come back, Tihe!" he cried in despair, struggling to stand up. The door swung open, but just then I heard an awful clatter. Professor Trottelreiner, losing his balance from an overly violent movement, had toppled over and fallen apart on the floor, hooks and hinges snapping like bones. I carried away with me the image of his helpless kicking, the falling iron stumps that sent chips of wood flying, the dark sack of the heart pounding desperately behind the scratched plastic. Down the corridor I ran, as if driven by 100 furies. The building swarmed with people. I had hit on the lunch hour. Out of the offices came clerks and secretaries, chatting as they headed for the elevators. I elbowed my way through the crowd toward one of the open doors, but apparently the elevator car hadn't yet arrived. Looking into the empty shaft, I immediately understood why panting was so common a phenomenon. The end of the cable, long since disconnected, was hanging loose, and the people were clambering, agile as monkeys, up the vertical cage that enclosed the shaft. They must have had a lot of practice. Crawling up to the snack bar on the roof, they conversed cheerfully despite the sweat dripping from their brows. I backed off slowly, then ran down the stairway that spiraled around the shaft, with the climbers patiently scaling its sides. A few flights lower, I slowed down. They were still powering out of all the doors. Nothing but offices here, evidently. At the end of the hall shone an open window, looking out on the street. I stopped by it, pretending to straighten my tie, and peered down. At first it seemed to me that there wasn't a living soul in that crowd on the sidewalk, but I simply hadn't recognized the pedestrians. The general splendor had disappeared without a trace. They walked separately, in pairs, clothed in rags, patches, holes, many with bandages and plasters, some in only their underwear, which enabled me to verify that they were indeed spotted and had bristles, mainly on their backs. A few evidently had been released from hospital to attend to some urgent business. Amputees and paraplegics rolled along on boards with little wheels, talking and laughing loudly. I saw women with drooping elephant flaps for ears, men with horns on their heads, old newspapers, clumps of straw or burlap bags carried with the utmost elegance and aplomb. Those who were healthier and in better condition raced on the road, cantering, prancing, kicking up their feet as if changing gears. Robots predominated in the crowd, wielding atomizers, dosimeters, spray guns, sprinklers. Their job was to see that everyone got his share of aerosol. Nor did they limit themselves to that. Behind one young couple, arms around each other, hers were covered with scales, his with boils, there plodded an old clunker, methodically beating the lovers over the head with a watering can. Their teeth rattled, but they were perfectly oblivious. Was it doing this on purpose? I could no longer think. Gripping the windowsill, I stared at the scene in the streets, its bustle, its rush, its industry, as if I were the only witness, the only pair of eyes. The only? No, the cruelty of this spectacle demanded at least another observer, its creator, the one who, without intervening in that grim panorama, would give it meaning, a patron, an impresario of decay, therefore a ghoul, but someone, a tiny juggermugger, cavorting around the legs of a spry old lady, repeatedly undercut her knees, and she fell flat on her face, got up, walked on, was tripped again, and so they went, it mechanically persistent, she energetic and determined until they were out of sight. Many of the robots hovered over the people, peering into their mouths, possibly to check the effects of the sprays, though it didn't exactly look that way. On the corner stood a bunch of robots, loiterants, dejects. Out of some side alley came shifts of drudgers, cludgers, maniacs, and manicoids. An enormous trashmaster rambled along the curb, lifting up on the claws of its shovel whatever lay in the way, tossing, together with junkets and self-aborts, an old woman into its disposal bin. I bit my knuckles, forgetting that that hand held the other vial, the second vial, and my throat was seared with fire. Everything wavered, a bright fog descended across my eyes like a blindfold, which an unseen hand then slowly began to lift. I looked, petrified, at the transformation taking place, realizing in a sudden shudder of premonition that now reality was slowing off yet another layer. Clearly, its falsification had begun so very long ago that even the most powerful antidote could do no more than tear away successive veils, reaching the veils beneath, but not the truth. It grew brighter, white. Snow lay on the pavement, frozen solid, trampled down by hundreds of feet. The street presented a bleak and colorless scene. The shops, the signs had vanished, and instead of glass in the windows, rotting boards, crossed and nailed together. Winter reigned between the dingy, discolored buildings. Long icicles hung from the lintels, lamps. In the sharp air there was a sour smell, and a bluish-grey haze like the sky above. Mounds of dirty snow along the walls, garbage heaped in the gutters. Here and there a shapeless bundle, a dark clump of rags kicked to the side by the constant stream of pedestrian traffic, or shoved between the rusty trash cans, tins, boxes, frozen sawdust. Snow wasn't falling at the moment, but one could see that it had fallen recently, and would again. Then, all at once, I knew what was missing. The robots. There wasn't a single robot on the street, not one. Their snow-covered bodies lay sprawled in doorways, lifeless iron hulks in the company of human refuse, scraps of clothing with an occasional bone showing underneath, yellow, sheathed with ice. One ragamuffin sat atop a pile of snow settling down for the night as if in a feather bed. I saw the contentment on his face. He felt right at home, apparently made himself comfortable, stretched his legs, wriggled his naked toes into the snow. So that was the chill, that strange invigoration which came over one from time to time, even in the middle of the street at noon, with the sun shining. He was already snoring peacefully, so that was the reason. The throngs of people passing by ignored him. They were occupied with themselves. Some were spraying others. It was easy to tell from their manner who thought himself a human and who a robot. So the robots too were only a fiction. And what was winter doing here in the middle of summer? Unless the whole calendar was a hoax. But why? Sleeping in snow to lower the birth rate. Whichever, someone had carefully planned it all, and I wasn't about to give up the ghost before I tracked him down. I lifted my eyes to the skyscrapers, their pock-marked sides and rows of broken windows. It was quiet behind me. Lunch was over. The street was all that was left to me now. My newfound sight would be to no advantage here. I would be swallowed up in that crowd, and I needed someone. Alone, I'd hide for a time like a rat. That was the most I could do, no longer safely inside the illusion, but shipwrecked in reality. Horrified, despairing, I backed away from the window, chilled to the bone, unprotected now by the lie of the temperate climate. I didn't know myself where I was going, trying to make as little noise as possible. Yes, I was already concealing my presence, crouching, skulking, furtively glancing over my shoulder, halting, listening. A creature of reflex, making no decisions, though I was certain that the fact that I could see was plainly written on my face, and I would have to pay for it. I went down the corridor. It was either the 6th or the 5th floor. I couldn't go back to Trottelreiner. He needed help, but I had none to give him. I was thinking feverishly about several things at once, but mainly about whether or not the drug would wear off and I would find myself back in paradise. Strange, but the prospect filled me with nothing but fear and loathing, as if I would have rather shivered in some garbage dump with the knowledge that that was what it was, than owed my deliverance to apparitions. My way down a side passage was blocked by an old man, too feeble to walk. He gave an imitation of it with his trembling legs, and managed a smile of greeting even as he breathed his last, the death rattle already in his throat. So I went another way, till I reached the frosted glass of some office. Complete silence inside. I entered through the swinging door and saw a hall with rows of typewriters, empty. At the other end, another door, half open. I could see into the large bright room and began to retreat, for someone was there, but a familiar voice rang out, "Come in, Tihe." So I went in. I wasn't even that surprised that he'd been waiting for me, and I took it calmly too, that there on the other side of the desk sat George P. Symington Esquire himself, in a grey flannel suit, a natty ascot around his neck, and a thin cigarillo in his mouth, and wearing sunglasses. He seemed to look at me with either amusement or regret, I couldn't tell which. "Have a seat," he said. "This will take a while." I sat. The room, with window panes intact, was an oasis of tidiness and warmth in the general neglect. No freezing drafts, no snowdrifts in the corner, a pot of steaming black coffee, an ashtray, a dictaphone, and, hanging on the wall above his head, a few female nudes, in colour. Odd, though, that those photographed bodies should have no scales or bristles, and odd that it should strike me odd. "Now you've done it," he said abruptly. "And note that you have only yourself to blame. The best nurse, the only soothsayer in the neighborhood, everyone doing its best to help you, but no, you had to go rooting around for the truth on your own." "Me?" I said, stunned by his words, and before I could gather my thoughts, before I could digest what he was saying, he snapped, "Please, no lies. It's a little late for that. You thought you were being so frightfully clever, parading out all those protests, those grievances of yours, those suspicions about hallucinating, sewers, hotel, rats, mounting, saddling. And did you really think such primitive inventions would serve the purpose? Only a grandfather stiff could be so incredibly stupid." I listened to him, my mouth hanging open. Then suddenly it hit me. Any denial would be in vain. He would never believe me, for he took my genuine obsessions for some sort of maneuver. In other words, that previous conversation in which he'd revealed to me the secrets of Procrustix Inc., it was only to draw me out. That was why he'd used those words which threw me into such confusion at the time. Perhaps he thought that they were passwords for initiation into some anti-psychem conspiracy. My private fear of hallucination he read as a tactical move, a gambit. Yes, it was indeed too late for explanations, particularly now that the cards were on the table. "You were waiting for me?" I asked. "Of course. With all your initiative and enterprise, we were in full control throughout. No unmonitored rebellion can be permitted to threaten the status quo." The old man dying in the corridor, it dawned on me. He too had been a part of the system of barriers that led me here. "A nice status quo," I said. "And you're in charge, I suppose? Congratulations." "Save your sarcasm for a more suitable occasion," he hissed. I succeeded in touching on a sore point. He was annoyed. "All this time you've been looking for some diabolical plot. Well, let me tell you, my fine feathered defrostee, let me satisfy your curiosity here and now. There's no such thing. It doesn't exist. Do you understand? We keep this civilization narcotized, for otherwise it would not endure itself. That is why its sleep must not be disturbed, and that is why you will be returned to it. Now, there is nothing to fear. For you, this will not only be painless, but pleasurable. Our lot is far more difficult. We must remain awake to watch over you." "Noble sacrifice," I said. "For the common good, no doubt." "If you value your almighty freedom of thought," he said coldly, "then I would advise you to drop these snide remarks, for you'll only have to part with it in that much sooner." "Very well, then. You have something else to tell me? I'm listening." "At this moment I am the only man in the whole state, besides yourself, who can see. What am I wearing on my face?" he suddenly asked, as if to trap me. "Sunglasses." "Then you see it as well as I," he said. The chemist who provided Trottelreiner with those antidotes had returned to the bosom of society and no longer harbors the least suspicion. No one must suspect. Surely you can understand that." "Wait a minute," I said. "It really matters to you, doesn't it, that I be convinced? But why?" "Soothsayers aren't monsters," he answered. "We are prisoners of the situation, backed into a corner, forced to play out the hand that history has dealt us. We bring peace and contentment in the only way remaining. We hold in precarious balance that which without us would plunge into the throes of universal agony. We are the last Atlas of this world, and if it must perish, let it at least not suffer. If the truth cannot be altered, let us at least conceal it. This is the last humanitarian act, the last moral obligation." "Then nothing can be done? Nothing at all?" I asked. "The year is 2098, he said, "with 69 billion inhabitants legally registered and approximately another 26 billion in hiding. The average annual temperature has fallen 4 degrees. In 15 or 20 years there will be glaciers here. We have no way of averting or halting their advance. We can only keep them secret." "I always thought there would be ice in hell," I said. "And so you paint the gates with pretty pictures." "Exactly," he said. "We are the last Samaritans. Someone had to speak to you from this place. It happens that I am that man." "Yes, I seem to recall. Ecce homo," I said. "But wait. Now I see what it is that you are after. You want to make a believer of me. You want me to accept your role of eschatological anesthetist. When there is no bread, let them eat opium. But I don't understand why you're so bent on my conversion, which in any event I'm to forget completely. If the methods you employ are good, then what's the point of all this reasoning and argument? A few drops of credentium, a single squirt in the eyes, and I applaud your every word with enthusiasm. You have my full approval, my esteem. If those methods are good, Yet apparently you yourself are not convinced of their worth, preferring simple old-fashioned hot air and rhetoric, wasting words on me instead of reaching for the atomizer. Apparently you're well aware that the triumph of Psychem is a sham, and you will be standing on the field alone, a conqueror with a bad case of heartburn. Yes, you wanted to win me over, then cast me off into oblivion, but it won't work. I say to hang with your lofty mission and those whores on the wall who soften the burden of your saviorhood. You like them the good old way, I take it, without bristles. His face twisted with rage. He jumped up, shouting, I have other drugs besides the heavenly delights. There are also chemical infernos. I stood up too. He was reaching for the button on his desk when I cried, We'll go together, and leaped for his throat. The momentum carried us, as I had hoped, to the open window. Then there were footsteps and iron hands trying to pull me from him, while he writhed and kicked, but we were on the sill now, and I was pushing him, bending him back, gathering the last of my strength, leaping. The air whistled in our ears. We went head over heels, still grappling. The spinning funnel of the street rushed up. I readied myself for a bone-crushing blow, but the impact when it came was soft. Black waves surging up and stinking, blessed waters closing over my head, then opening again. I surfaced in the middle of the sewer, wiping my eyes, gulping, choking on the foul swill, but happy. Professor Trottelreiner, roused from his slumber by my ungodly howls, leaned out over the edge of the platform and offered me, like a brotherly hand, the handle of his tightly wound umbrella. The thunder of the LTN bombs was dying down. The Hilton managers were all spread out in a row on their inflatable reclining chairs, inflatable infragrantable, the concubaloons, and the secretaries were carrying on most provocatively in their sleep. Jim Stantor, snoring, turned over on his side and nearly smothered a rat that was nibbling at the chocolate in his pocket. Both were frightened. Meanwhile, Professor Dringelbaum, that methodical Swiss, was squatting next to the wall, and by the yellowish glow of the flashlight making corrections in his paper with a fountain pen. Then it occurred to me that this intense activity of his was heralding the beginning of the second day of deliberations for the Futurological Congress, and I burst into such violent laughter that the manuscript slipped from his hands, hit the dark water with a splash, and floated away, off, into the unknown future.